understood, the notion of minus and plus isn't well defined. That doesn't mean the notion of infinity is contradictory. It certainly doesn't mean the universe had to have a beginning. It's very easy to refute this part of Dr. Craig's position. It could be true that before every event that took place, there was another one. That makes perfectly good sense. And if it were true, there's no first event. There's nothing for God to cause. Let me repeat that. Every event follows another one. I hope Dr. Craig can tell us later on tonight which of those 5 words he doesn't understand. But then he tells us modern physics confirms that the universe had a cause. Again, this is simply a misleading distortion. Some physicists, it's true, many I expect, think that time itself began about 15 billion years ago. Does that mean that there was some time before the universe began, when the cause of the universe, this person, was hanging around waiting to bring it about? No, it doesn't. All that it means is that at every time the universe existed, and there was no time before the universe existed. There was no time in which God could have acted. But let's suppose he's right about that. He's not, but let's suppose that he is. Does this mean that this being, or this cause of the universe, was a person? No, of course it doesn't. Dr. Craig gives 2 arguments for thinking it was a person. The first one is that it can't be physical, and the only non-physical things he knows of are abstract objects in human minds. It can't be an abstract object, therefore it was a human mind. Now, this is based on a philosophical view that was popular in the 17th century, known as Cartesian dualism, which is the view that human minds are not physical objects and are not dependent in some sense on physical processes. I hesitate to appeal to authority, but given the brevity of time that I have, I will have to, and say that the naivety of this view today is very well documented and needs no further comment from me. The second argument that Dr. Craig gives is that the cause of the universe, because it was eternal or outside time, must have been a person. If it wasn't, if it was a physical or, non-personal thing, how could it be just hanging around waiting to cause things? Well, it seems to me that all the persons and person-like things I know act in time. I've certainly never come across a physical thing that is outside of time, but I've never come across a person either that is outside of time. So perhaps Dr. Craig would like to give us a better reason for thinking that this object, which he still hasn't proved to exist, is indeed anything like a person. And even if it was a person, why should we think that this very same being that created the universe then hung around doing nothing for 15 billion years and then suddenly starts parceling out real estate and impregnating virgins? If Dr. Craig could give us a reason to believe that, I'd go away much happier tonight. Okay, now let's move on. Dr. Craig tells us that it's incredibly unlikely that these physical constants, which he says determine the beginning of the universe, permit life. I'm moving on now, if you want to look at Dr. Craig's handout, to what's called the fine-tuning argument. But what I want to know in answer to that question is where on earth he gets these probabilities from. Where on earth the idea comes from that it's incredibly unlikely that we should live in a life-permitting universe. Imagine somebody tossing a coin and it lands heads. And I say, wow, that's amazing. It must have been fixed. It was incredibly unlikely to land heads. Now, that's absurd. You say, why? And I say, well, there's millions of things it could have done. It could have landed on its side. It could have gone up into space and never come back. It could have turned into an elephant. It could have just vanished. There's millions of things it could have done, so it's millions and millions to one that it landed heads. Now, that would be really stupid. But what I'm saying is that I've plucked the probabilities out of thin air in that case, and I say Dr. Craig has plucked these probabilities out of thin air in this case. Now, in saying what they are, he's hidden behind authority, but given how important this question is, I'm sure he's taken the trouble to work them out for himself. I'm sure he's taken the trouble to find out what the evidence is for assigning these probabilities. So I'd like to hear that tonight. Then we have the argument for moral objectivity. I'll come back to this in the next round and hopefully in the questions, but I will briefly discuss it now. Dr. Craig tells us that we need God if there are to be objective moral values. Now, there's two things I want to say about that very briefly. The first thing is that if there are any objective moral values, I know that murdering innocent people is wrong. I know that laying siege to a town and slaughtering all its inhabitants is wrong. That's why I think Srebrenica was wrong. If moral objective values come from the God that Dr. Craig believes in, then that's right. Just look in the book of Joshua. What does he say? Kill everybody except the whore who lives in that town and protected by messengers. So it looks like, if we do think objective moral values come from God, it looks like we should say Srebrenica was all right. In any case, what reason is there for thinking there are objective moral values? There must be a good argument for this. After all, there are no objective aesthetic values, quite plausibly, so Dr. Craig must give us an argument for saying there are objective moral ones. What is the argument? Well, it was striking, so I wrote it down. He said, there are objective moral values because deep down we know there are. That's it. That's the argument. Now, that may pass for an argument in Talbot Theological College. It may indeed pass for an argument in the White House. But, but this is Cambridge, and it doesn't pass for an argument here. Next we have the resurrection. Oh yes. Now, this is a really extraordinary claim. We're told that we have huge amounts of evidence for saying that Jesus was raised from the dead and taken up into heaven. I just want to make 2 points about this. The first one is that if you have such an extraordinary claim as that, you're going to want pretty strong evidence. Hearsay is not going to be enough. Eyewitness testimony from about 1,500 people might just about do it. But then 1,500 people saw David Copperfield make the Statue of Liberty vanish. Nobody thinks it really did. Second point, of course, is that the source of evidence is pretty suspect. Let me give you one example from the Gospels. Matthew chapter 27, when Jesus died, there was an earthquake. Matthew chapter 28, when Jesus died, the undead started walking the streets. Now, Mark is the earliest Gospel. None of this is in Mark. If our sources start contradicting themselves in this way, you might just start to wonder whether anything they say is true. Now, the last argument Dr. Craig gives, he actually admits is not an argument at all. This is the argument, so-called argument, from experience. I'll just give an analogy for that. Suppose that you saw a donkey appearing on stage right here, okay? Well, that would be rather strange, but you might say, okay, well, maybe there's a donkey. But now suppose that the person next to you said, oh no, it isn't a donkey, it's a pig. And suppose there are lots of other people in the corner who said, no, it's a horse. And so suppose there's a whole lot of people over here who said they saw nothing at all. Now in that case, I think you would be pretty sensible to doubt your experience. You would be pretty sensible to think, well, actually, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not really seeing a donkey. But now this is the position with so-called religious experience. With religious experience, you have a large number of groups of people, all of whom claim to have experience, and all of whom claim to have experience of different truths. Surely the right thing to say then is, maybe it's not a donkey. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should see an optician. This is not what Dr. Craig is saying. Dr. Craig is saying it's definitely a donkey. So I want to ask him, and I hope he can tell us tonight, why is everybody else wrong? Why are all the Jews and the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Hindus and the atheists wrong for having different religious experiences for you? Of course, he admits this isn't an argument, so I won't press him too much to return to it. I turn now to my arguments for not believing in God. And as I say, I must apologize for the fact that there are more people than handouts. I basically have 3 arguments. The first one really depended on Dr. Craig, but he obliged, so that's fine. The argument was this. It was based on something that Berkeley said, George Berkeley, who was a bishop, as many of you will know. Berkeley said that if you don't have a reason to believe in something, that's a reason not to believe in it. We've got no reason to believe in the tooth fairy. We've got no reason to believe in leprechauns. We've got no reason to believe in Krishna or Allah. We've got no reason to believe in any of these supernatural things. And those are reasons not to believe in them. The same is true of the God that Dr. Craig believes in. So the feebleness of Dr. Craig's arguments is itself an argument in my favour. And I claim they are feeble. The second argument is very well known. It's the argument from evil, perhaps best presented in a 1980s book by the great philosopher, the excellent philosopher, John Mackey. This argument is very simple. It says that there are some things that are gratuitously harmful. There are some things that did harm and never did anyone any good at all. A favourite example of people, and one that I'm going to use, is the First World War. In the First World War, millions of young men, younger than me, younger than most of you, died agonising deaths from poison gas. I was unlucky enough once to breathe chlorine for a few seconds, and it was literally, it was a gut-wrenching experience. It was horrible. I can't begin to imagine what it must have been like to die from being gassed. Now, if God's benevolent, couldn't he have made their suffering just a little bit less? And if he's so powerful, couldn't he have made their suffering just a little bit less without making anybody else suffer in recompense? Well, he didn't. So either he couldn't or he wouldn't. If he couldn't, he's impotent, or at least not as powerful as the God Christians believe in. If he wouldn't, he's either stupid or wicked. It seems to me that any reasonable view of the history of the world would give us far better reason for thinking that Satan is in charge around these parts, not Jehovah. My final argument, then, is, in a sense, the opposite of Dr. Craig's argument concerning objectivity, moral objectivity. And this is the argument that genuine belief in God, not, as I said, tea with the vicar, but genuine belief in God, actually warps our moral views. It actually makes us think that things are right, which only a sick pervert would think is right. I gave you an example in the handout, which was this. The example was that in the Iran-Iraq war, children would be sent to walk across minefields by the Iranian government. And the mullahs who sent them would give them little plastic keys and say, you walk across the minefield, and if you get blown up, it'll be great, because these keys are the keys to paradise. It's not just Islam. Israel and Christians have done this too. The Israeli Defense Force bombs schools, murders children, bulldozes hospitals for a small piece of land, simply on religious grounds. Now, this is all sick for me. It's not just wrong, it's sick. But if you believe in a God who gives us an afterlife, then there is nothing wrong with it at all. What is wrong with removing somebody from this vale of tears, especially if you make them a martyr? You're doing them a service. As I said on the handout, Harold Shipman, Fred West, Hitler, Stalin himself, they're no worse than somebody who fast forwards through the video, through the trailers on the video, so you get to the film.